One of the things that, as I was preparing this talk, came back to me was how speed and slowness slide into one another. So speed and slowness are not only relational, but they tend in surprising ways to slide into one another. So for instance, a race car driver was in an accident and he was thrown 30 feet into the air. And after the crash, he recalled, and if you have a handout, this is the first number, he recalled, quote, "It seemed like the whole thing took forever, like I was a player on a stage and could see myself tumbling over and over." So this one instant to this speedy race car driver, this one instant seemed to take forever. And in a different and I hope less lethal register, this talk also mixes speed and slowness. And what I want to do, and it's kind of a counterintuitive thing, I wanted to try to give you, in about 40 minutes or a little less, the gist of this book that's coming out in the spring. So issues of tempo are actually at play in my talk as well. Where do I speed up? Where do I pause to ruminate? So you'll see how this works out or doesn't work out, but it creates a little tension that I sort of like. Okay. But I don't just want to describe slow art, and I'll come to that in a minute. I also want to advocate for an aesthetics of slowness. And the mantra that I'm going to keep repeating over the talk, and that if there's anything that you take away with you, I hope it's this, that slow art is doubly good, that slow art is good for the work of art, and slow art is good for the observer of art. So slow art is doubly good. So there's an ethical edge to this talk and to the book. So I don't know if you know this. I was surprised myself to learn that many more Americans go to art museums and galleries in any given year than attend both professional sporting events and amusement parks. Go figure. But the question that follows, and we'll be talking about, is what happens once they get there? What happens when they're standing in front of a Van Gogh at the Art Institute? So that's kind of what I want to talk about today. Well, even if I am Scrooge, I'm not alone in advocating for slowness. In fact, slowness has become hot property. As you know, there's the slow food movement, which began in 1986, followed by all sorts of manifestations of slowness, like slow history, slow journalism, slow travel, slow money, slow news cycles. Handout number 2, this is a quotation from President Obama. "There is an impatience that characterizes Washington, an attention span that has only grown shorter with the 24-hour news cycle, and insists on instant gratification in the form of immediate results or higher poll numbers. When a crisis hits, there's all too often a lurch from shock to trance, with everyone responding to the tempest of the moment until the furor has died down and the media coverage has moved on, instead of confronting the major challenges." So where do we see slowness? Even in issues of warfare and diplomacy. The next item on your handout is a quotation from Paul Virilio, who is our premier theorist of speed. He coined something called the dromocratic revolution, dromo from the Greek word for to run. Here's what Virilio says. "Time light, that is the speed of light, has replaced the categories of space and time as information travels everywhere instantly." He goes on, "Today, speed is war, the last war, instantly televised. What that means is that politics becomes pro-motion." Think of a hyphen, pro and motion. So heads of state have no time to negotiate because technology has reduced the warning time for war to a matter of seconds. It follows, and he italicizes this in his book, it follows that, quote, "To disarm would thus mean first and foremost to decelerate." there's even, as you see, slow sex. The author is a therapist in San Francisco, and she wrote this book, and if you look on the internet, you'll see that she makes this sort of weird claim. She says, "This book will teach any man to bring any woman to orgasm in 15 minutes." I don't know where the disconnect is, but there's something weird going on there. So here are all of these outcroppings of slowness, and I'm interested in what that means, what that says about our culture. And my suspicion is that these outcroppings of slowness have something to do with what's going on in our culture, with a need that matches our need for speed, our need to decelerate, our need to get off the treadmill. And my suspicion is that that's a feeling that some of you may share. But I got ahead of myself. What is slow art? You might think, and I thought at first, that slow art must be a collection of aesthetic objects. But it's not. Slow art is rather a relationship. Slow art is what happens when, as in this wonderful Thomas Struth photograph, the observer meets the object. So slow art is something transactional, and it happens in the moment when you're not looking at something virtual, when you're looking at Rembrandt itself. Now, there are two ways that the experience of slow art, and please remember it is an experience, there are two ways that the experience of slow art can be initiated. The observer can spark the slow art experience, or the object can spark the slow art experience. So either the object beckons you, or, as the French novelist Flaubert said, this is a quote, "Anything becomes interesting if you look at it long enough." Kind of the contrary of what you might imagine. Anything becomes interesting if you look at it long enough. That is, when you initiate the slow experience. Slow art includes a wide variety of visual arts. And I just quickly want to go through a few examples that fit under the umbrella of slow art. This is a brand new installation opened just a month or two ago by Robert Irwin in Marfa, Texas. It belongs to the Terra Foundation, and it's in a former infirmary in what was, as you may know, a military camp that Donald Judd bought. And inside, what Irwin has done is to install a series of scrims that go floor to ceiling. And as the sun is setting, you get all sorts of wonderful effects of shadow and light and repeated reflections. And some of these, can you hear me? Am I still there? Okay. Some of these reflections pick up shadows from trees outside, so they look sort of like landscape paintings, repeated and varied inside. Or here is a James Turrell sky space at Pomona College, where I teach. And the idea is that you sit on, you sit on these benches and you look up through the oculus, and as the sun is setting, the light changes. There are a series of LED lit color changes, and Turrell's mantra is that the sky isn't blue, we make it blue. And I could show you other slides, but we don't have time, where you would see the color of the sky actually change. If anybody's been to a sky space, you know what I mean. If you haven't, I recommend. Here are some Richard Serra torqued ellipses at Dia Beacon, which you wander into, so you can't experience them except in time. Here is a still from a video by the American video artist Eve Sussman called 89 Seconds at the Alcazar. which shows you how Velázquez Las Meninas came to be. So all of these figures have been wandering through the space, and as the video progresses, you're watching for them to take the composition that we all expect, which they do, but only for an instant. And then the dog rolls over, the dwarf goes off his way, the maids vacate, so it's like a money shot. It's another fast and slow experience. Here is a still, you guessed it, from Andy Warhol's multi-hour movie Empire. This is one of my favorite slow art experiences, Walter Di Maria's Lightning Field in rural New Mexico. And of course, the punchline is, it's fine if lightning happens, but the real show is back baby. The real show is what happens with these 400 aluminum lightning rods that form a grid, a kilometer on one side, a mile on the other. And in the middle of the day, the grids are more or less invisible because they reflect whatever's around them. But as the sun is setting or rising, they light up. It almost feels like they vibrate, but they are also changing every minute as the sun changes. Okay, here is obviously a moment from Hitchcock's Psycho, but this is actually a still from a 1993 work by Douglas Gordon called 24-Hour Psycho, in which he took the whole movie and introduced about 2.5 seconds between every frame so that the movie stretches out to 24 hours. This is a scene that Don DeLillo used to open one of his novels. So all of these experiences are examples of slow art, and all of these experiences are generated by the object. But one thing that you will have noticed is that all of these experiences are time-based. So I want to know what happens when you look at a painting that presumably you can look at for an instant or for a much longer time. So my answer to what happens when you look at a painting involves the first of two stories I want to tell you. And the story involves a collaboration between the object and the observer. So this is a painting by Edouard Manet called Young Lady in 1866. And it hangs in the Metropolitan Museum. I happened on this painting in the spring of 1990 in the company of some friends. We were headed for Cézanne, and we never got there. And I ended up looking at this painting for about 8 years. Okay, you can call me certifiable and yank me off the stage. How did it happen? Well, okay, imagine that it's a life-size painting. The colors here don't nearly do justice to the Manet, but her robe, her peignoir, is this luscious combination of grays and whites and pinks. It's sort of like mushing raspberries into cream cheese. And the peignoir is so large that you get lost in those luscious folds. So the first thing that struck me and my companions was just the visual force, the visual impact of the painting. But the more I looked at it, the stranger it became. So here's a painting that looks perfectly straightforward. What have we got? We've got one woman, we've got one parrot, we've got one Velázquez-like background, we've got a piece of fruit at the bottom of the parrot's perch. There's nothing hidden. But the longer I looked at the painting, the stranger it became. So for instance, just for starters, why would Manet have painted a woman and a parrot together? As if it went without saying, as if he were painting a virgin and a dove together. And then, why is she carrying what turns out to be a man's monocle? And then, who sent her this little bouquet of Parma violets? And then what about her expression? Is she lost in reverie? Is she staring out at us? Has she come back from an evening? Is she about to go out for an evening? And even what she's wearing, is this a house robe, or is it a dress? Because it turns out that this painting was made in the spring of 1866. And if you look at, as I'm sure many of you have, the fashion magazines from Paris in the spring of 1866, big controversy. The Empress Eugénie comes to a fancy ball, and she's not wearing a crinoline, one of those things with a cage and the skirts balloon out. She wore something without a cage, and this made revolutionary noise in the fashion industry. So it isn't even clear what the young lady is wearing. But we know that time is important because Manet says 1866 in the title. It's the only time he ever used a date in a title. I could go on and talk about the fact that the model is Victorine Meurent, who had last posed for Manet a few years earlier as Olympia. So if you know who the model is, you've already seen her naked. So this is kind of like the opposite of a striptease. Or you both know what she looks like naked, and now you know what she looks like with clothes on. Okay, so these were some of the things that interested me. And what happened was I would look at the painting, I would think about it, I would go home, I would say, now I wonder what's the story of that monocle? So I went to DC, I went to the Smithsonian, I looked through their monocle archive, and that's when I discovered that in 1866, only men would have worn monocles like this. And then I found weird evidence in Proust of a general who wears a monocle, and I won't go into all these details. Okay, do I have time? No, I don't. But I can point you to self-advertisement, Shameless. This book on Manet and Flaubert has a chapter that talks about each of the individual items in the painting. What matters is that the painting and I collaborated. I would ask questions, the painting would answer questions. In answering the questions, the painting posed to me more questions. And it became a kind of parlor game for me to see just how long I could sustain this conversation. And as you know, it lasted for about 8 years, and a book emerged from it, although that had never been my intention. I was just having fun. So when the book was over, I happened to go back to the Metropolitan years later, and I was walking towards something else, but down the corridor where this painting usually hung, and I looked to my left to see if it was up or out traveling. And there it was up, and I thought, do I want to look at it again? And I thought, no, I want to go right past. And I felt sort of embarrassed. I said, what? What's that about? So I thought about it, and what I concluded was, how could I, for so long, have been fixated on this one little object, this oil painting, 8 years of my life, and they'd gone by awfully quickly. Well, I had had a good time, but there was still something disturbing about it. So in order to assuage my uncomfortable feelings, I thought, okay, here was my end of the bell curve experience, but could there be anything in my experience that would benefit other people with less time on their hands? And that's how I came to write Slow Art. So that book grew out of the earlier book. And the wager that I made in the book is, once again, that slow art is good both for the object and for the observer. So what do I mean when I say it's good for the object? This is an installation shot from a wonderful show of Ad Reinhardt paintings at David Zwirner 3 or 4 years ago. These paintings are all 5 foot square, and if you look at them quickly, they simply look like black monochromes. But if you give yourself over to these paintings, if you open yourself up to them, if you station yourself there, you'll see that eventually they resolve into checkerboards, 9 little squares, 3, 3, and 3, each with a subtly different hue, sometimes a little purple, sometimes a little blue, sometimes a little red. But these checkerboards only emerge if you give the painting time. So there's a kind of classic, straightforward example of slowing down for the sake of the object. This reminds me of a wonderful question that somebody asked the Los Angeles artist Ed Ruscha. Somebody said, and it's a great question, "Mr. Ruscha, how can you tell a good artwork from a bad?" Ruscha thought about it for a minute and he said, "Okay." He said, "With a bad artwork, you look at it and you say, wow. And then you look again and you say, no, maybe not. With a good artwork," he said, "it's the opposite." So to understand a painting is going to take time. This is not a very good slide of a Mark Rothko painting. And I have a kind of nice piece of fictional testimony about the experience of looking at a Rothko. Okay, so Ruscha says you've got to stick with the painting. Then one of the things that I discovered as I was working on slow art is how long does the average American spend looking at a work of art? People have studied this, and it turns out the average length of time for this encounter is 6 to 10 seconds. Well, according to people like Ruscha, that isn't enough. Here's what 2 museum educators said, and this is handout number 4. "Watching visitors as they wander through the galleries is a disheartening experience. In general, they glance only cursorily at a work and then make a careful study of the label beside it." A cognitive psychologist who studied visitor patterns at MoMA noticed that most visitors, quote, "had contact with art during their lives, but spent little of it with eyes on canvas, looking deeply for an extended time and thinking about what they saw." So, what happens when we remain with a work of art, when, as I said, we open ourselves to it? Here's an overexposed Rothko, but I want to quote from John Logan's play, Red, which is about Mark Rothko and a new studio assistant. So the studio assistant comes to work the first day, and Rothko wants to educate him. So he kind of grabs the new assistant by the neck and puts him in front of the painting, and this is what he says. "Wait. Stand closer. You've got to get close. Let it work on you. Let it embrace you, filling even your peripheral vision so nothing else exists or has ever existed or will ever exist. Let the picture do its work, but work with it. Meet it halfway, for God's sake. Lean forward, lean into it, engage with it. The more you look at them," he's talking about all his paintings now, he says, "the more you look at them, the more they move. They move through space if you let them. This movement takes time, so they're temporal, they require time." I sort of wish I had written that, but I'm just as glad that I didn't because it's such a wonderful example of slow art as a collaborative enterprise. I'm going to show you one more painting. This is a monochrome by the New York painter Josef Marioni, made in 2002. And thanks to the artist, it's the cover of my book. What makes Marioni stand out from other monochrome painters is what happens at the bottom of his canvases along here. He will use several different veils of paint, very thinly applied, so that even though this is a red painting, it may have some yellow in it, it may have some purple, it may have some blue. But what I want to focus on is the bottom of the painting, where you see these drips, and there's also some veil of the color underneath. Well, these drips are interesting to me because one of the ways that I think objects that spark slow art work is they either entail something that has been moving and stops eventually, or something that is stationary and seems very gradually to rustle into motion. So you could look at these drips, and you could imagine either that it's coagulating as it slows down, or that it's been still and it's about to drop off. In either case, the painting is moving. And just as in the John Logan quotation, he says, let them move. If you give them time, they will move. So another one of my mantras in the book is that paintings, if you know how to look at them, that paintings are actually moving pictures. Paintings are moving pictures because they change in your experience as you look at them as much as if you were watching a movie, something would change. The same, by the way, is true with literature. I'm working with my students on a Shakespeare sonnet, and by the end of our conversation, even though the print on the page hasn't changed, our experience of the sonnet has changed. So what these drips suggest to me is that an image can expand into an event, like something dropping off, or an event can coalesce, can gel in an image so that the drip stops dropping. Okay, so I've talked already for a while. What I want us to do now is have a little slow art experience together. What I'm going to do is show you 30 seconds of a 7-minute and 11-second video. And I'm not going to tell you who made it, I'm not going to tell you anything about it, but at the end of my remarks, we'll watch the whole 7 minutes and 11 seconds, and we'll see what happens. Okay. So, a little reprise. Slow art is collaborative. We've seen how slow art is good for the object, but how is slow art good for the observer? To speak to that question, we need a little history lesson. And now I think I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. Okay. Presumably, it's always been possible to look at an image for a long time. But the character of that experience changes radically over history. So I had to learn how people encountered images before the age of art, before the Renaissance. Here is a wonderful passage from the art historian Hans Beltone. The beholder is deliberately drawn into the pictures, which seem to belong to a common space that allows one to meet the saints without respect to time and place. The gold foil of the background avoids any specific setting that would remove the picture from the beholder. He loses the feeling for the so-called aesthetic boundary that usually contrasts the reality of the picture with the viewer's own reality. So, for instance, if you are a believer and you're staring at a painting of the penitent Magdalene, and lots of people reported this, you would actually see her tears falling, something like a sacred version of Marioni's drips. So what changed? Modernity happened. Speed happened. This is a wonderful picture by two American brothers named Anthony called Broadway on a Rainy Day, taken around 1860. So two massive cultural shifts happened across the 18th century, and they altered this viewing situation irrevocably. The two are acceleration and secularization. So acceleration is an uptick in speed so important that it has come to define modernity itself. And if you look at the next handout, I quote 4 cultural critics. The first is historian Hartmut Rosa. The history of modernity has been an ongoing process of social acceleration marked by an unprecedented, easily measurable, and uncontroversial speed-up of processes of transport, of communication, of economic production. Together, they result in an ever-increasing pace of social change and perpetual pressure on the speed of social life itself. Underscore that pressure on the speed of social life itself. David Harvey says, we've been experiencing an intense phase of time-space compression that has had a disorienting and disruptive impact upon political, economic practices, the balance of class power, as well as upon cultural and social life. I'm going to skip the next one and just give you a little bit from Kurt Anderson, the novelist. Waiting a while to get everything you want was a definition of maturity. Demanding satisfaction right this instant, on the other hand, is a defining behavior of 7-year-olds. The powerful appeal of the web is not just the community it enables, but its instantaneity. As a result, delayed gratification came to seem quaint and unnecessary. So, cultural acceleration. Simultaneously, the Enlightenment brings secularization. Next item on the handout, 2 passages from the philosopher Hegel. No matter how excellent we find the statues of the Greek gods, no matter how we see God the Father, Christ, and Mary so estimably and so perfectly portrayed, it is no help. We bow the knee no longer before these artworks. Again, the statues are now only corpses from which the living soul has flown, just as the hymns are words from which belief has fled. Now, what matters is the interaction of these two. So, however much we may be addicted to speed, it takes its toll. It can't be sustained. We need breathers. But just as our need for timeouts grows, so the means to meet that need shrink. Just as our need for timeouts, for pauses, increases at the same time, because of secularization, traditional ways of experiencing that deceleration are less and less available. In other words, if you compare modern life to a German Autobahn, everybody is speeding along, everybody needs off-ramps, but you find the rest stop is closed. We bow the knee no longer. So I asked myself, what for us moderns can take the place of the worshipful gaze? And you guessed the answer, slow art. If so, could Hans Belting's experience be replaced by our engaging with a Monet painting, or a Turrell, or a Warhol, or an Abramovic, or a Di Maria? In a secular age, could looking at art, could encountering art offer us something like the possibility for the consolation that people felt engaging with sacred images? So I came to define slow art as the secular displacement of earlier practices of looking. The idea is that contemplating art can occupy the social spaces that formerly happened in religious spaces. And as somebody pointed out to me, the word contemplation comes from the Latin con plus templum, which means a place for observation. So that's how slow art can benefit not just the art object, but the observer. Let me give you 2 very quick examples. Here is an installation in Amsterdam's Nieuwe Kerk of an Andy Warhol 1986 double pink Last Supper. I don't have time to talk about it. Here is a building that is under construction in Austin, Texas, designed by Ellsworth Kelly. And if it looks sort of like a chapel, you're not mistaken. Okay, so I realize this is not necessarily a popular view, that art can offer something like spiritual experiences. And of course, there's no turning back the clock. We cannot have the experiences that medieval beholders did. We live in an age of irony, of disillusionment, of skepticism. So how in our ironic age could we have something comparable to the spiritual vision? So I want to tell you the second story, but here I switch to literature. A 1994 story by the novelist Don DeLillo, a story called The Angel Esmeralda. This is a story about 2 nuns who minister to the wretched of the South Bronx. And none is more wretched than the 12-year-old girl Esmeralda, who is raped and then thrown to her death from a building. the older nun, Sister Edgar, follows the crowds every evening as they go to an expressway, and they stand by the expressway waiting for a commuter train to come by. When, after 20 minutes, the commuter train does, it lights up a billboard for Minute Maid orange juice, and the crowd sees what? They see an apparition of Esmeralda as an angel. So what are we to make of this? Is this just a freakish accident? Are we to pity these poor people because they're benighted, they still believe in superstition? The story doesn't tip its hand, and that, I think, is what's so wonderful about it. It's a story about the need to make sense of senseless violence. So the story leaves us asking, do the lights of that train actually produce a vision, or do viewers' needs generate a vision? And maybe the answer is irrelevant. What finally matters in this story is the power of vision to turn visionary, to comfort the grieving. So the story gets it both ways. It's not either or, it's both and. Okay, I'm going to skip the question that I really want to talk about, but maybe you'll indulge me afterwards, and we can talk about spirit and spectacle and the career of James Turrell. So here's an early Turrell, a middle Turrell, and a late Turrell. You can see that something's happened. But here, as promised, is this video. And now I can tell you it is by the British artist Sam Taylor Johnson, who used to be known as Sam Taylor Wood until she married Aaron Johnson, her junior, by 23 years. So the one thing I would ask you is to notice what's fast and what's slow. So here's the tension between speed and slowness. I promised that I would not go over my allotted time. I want to save 15 minutes for us to talk. So I'm wondering if it's possible to raise the lights, but still let people see the video to its end, and then we can start talking, and we can multitask. Okay, let's talk. Questions, comments, protests?
Hello, can you hear me? Oh, hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for that engaging talk. I think it's very fascinating. So as someone who studies not the visual arts, but the verbal arts, I can't help but liken the slow encounter with an art object with close reading. I think a lot of what you're describing, close reading already does. So I wonder how this kind of prolonged inspection of a passage's composition that you get in close reading, how that might unveil certain functions in the text that you missed before with speed reading. And I also like to believe that the text changes when you perform a close reading. And it relates, I think, to this epiphenomenon that you're describing of slowness, in that the painting changes as you look at it for a longer time. So a question that I've been asking myself for a while is, whether you're a close reader or someone who engages slowly with a painting, how might that transaction kind of distort the text for you, in that you impose a composure that is not there originally?
I'm sorry, impose a what that's not there?
A composure. Composure.
I'm still missing that word. Composure. Okay,
Composure.
lovely word.
I mean, I would say that the objects that you're looking at are rather easy on the eyes. What about objects that are unsettling or disorienting, like assemblage art, for example?
Wow, that's a whole grocery basket of questions. But thank you. So let me talk a little bit about close reading, and I couldn't imagine a better question, because I never studied art, visual arts, in college or in graduate school. It's something that I came to mid-career, and fortunately, teaching it at a laissez-faire liberal arts college, I was able to start indulging that passion, and so that I sometimes teach literature classes, I sometimes teach art history classes. So I'm thinking about this issue all the time, and I suppose it all started with my being dyslexic. So I've always been a very slow reader. The challenge then was to turn that into a career. I'm serious. So what I practice in all of my classes at whatever level is close reading. And I'm always quoting to my students this wonderful aphorism from Nietzsche. Nietzsche says, "Reading is rumination. Reading is rumination." And I said to my students, "What does that mean?" And they say, "Oh, reading means thinking hard." And I say, yeah, but what else? And finally somebody will say, "Oh, don't cows ruminate?" Exactly Nietzsche's point, that he wants to tie the physical process of digestion to the intellectual process of close reading. So I do think the experience of close reading changes the text every bit as much as looking slowly does. I think there's a very close parallel. I think the difference is, and it's something that I talk about with my students, when we're reading a short text like a sonnet, and I don't want to get too far away from the visual arts, but we're doing two things. We're doing a synchronic reading and a diachronic reading. In other words, we're reading through the text line by line. We're having a temporal experience so that when we get to the end of a line and there's a funny line break, it means something. But we also are like in a helicopter hovering over the text so that we can pick out things from different parts and consider them simultaneously. With the visual arts, we have a lot more leeway. So that's what I would say about that. As far as assemblage art goes, Yeah, it's a huge challenge. But I think one of the lessons for me is I don't try to take in everything. I try to fix on something that interests me. I try to grab onto one moment and ruminate it and see where it leads me without feeling like I'm ever going to master the image. Because in fact, whether it's a fairly straightforward-looking object like the Monet lady with the parrot, or whether it's an incredibly complex assemblage, I'm never going to master it. I'm never going to be able to see everything that's going on. Okay? Thank you.
So you mentioned Andy Warhol a few times. And would you agree that Andy Warhol is really champion of slow art because of his paintings, photographs, and actually movies that maybe 24 hours and nothing changed, similar to your video? And it was, so in a sense, would you agree that it was a breakthrough in this time because he uniquely represents the slowness in all different type of arts?
So if I understand correctly, you're asking, is Andy Warhol a slow artist? Is that?
Not only champion of slow art.
Champion of slow art, thank you, thank you. Yeah, totally. No, also, I've paid these two people to ask these questions. Originally, the book was going to end with James Turrell. And then my friend Kurt Anderson, whom I quoted, said, wait a minute, what about Warhol? He said, aren't Warhol and Turrell the angel and devil of slow art? And I said, yeah, I got to talk about Warhol. And the thing that's wonderful about Warhol is you can slice and dice him any way you like. The Warhol who said everybody's going to have 15 seconds of fame is also the Warhol who produced these multi-hour movies in which nothing happens. And a member of the factory, whose name is escaping me at the moment, said that I think Andy's greatest paintings are his films. So yes, a champion.
Are religious observation and slow art mutually exclusive?
No.
You seem to talk about them as an alternative.
Yeah, partly it's that I'm going fast, right? No, I think it is certainly possible to be a believer and have meaningful experiences in a religious setting. But what I was trying in the book to do was sort of, okay, those people have already got their consolation. They know how to find it. What I wanted to address was a secular viewer and say, is there anything that in your experience that could in some way parallel or address the same experience that believers have? So I don't think there's anything mutually exclusive at all. In fact, I think they reinforce each other.
Thank you. Just an observation and then a question. The observation, I think, I remember once being in Colmar and seeing a triptych that had been in an infirmary, and the idea that slow art was not only consoling, but also transcendental for people there. So thank you for making those connections. My question is, if you wanted to experience slow art yourself or to like bring children or others and help them to experience slow art, what would you tell them? What steps should they take when they settle themselves in front of something? Like, is there something they should look for, or how should they get into that slow art experience?
I'm going to pay you for that question, too. One of the things that I realized as I was writing this book is it made me a Jeffersonian Democrat, which is to say, I think that everybody is not only entitled to have slow art experiences, but already equipped. So I used to teach an art history class that started with Degas, and we would look at this 1865 Degas painting called the Bellelli family. It's about an unhappy family. And I would put the slide on the screen, and I would just say to my students, what do you notice? And because everybody can affect onto an unhappy family, they started talking about what's going on between the parents and which daughter likes the mother and which daughter likes the father. And eventually they would start talking about other things like formal relationships. And then somebody would say, well, why did he put a mirror above the mantelpiece? Okay, an hour goes by and class is over and I say, are we finished talking about this painting? Oh, no, we got to come back. I say, all right, the rest of the class is all going to be downhill. The whole semester will be easy after this, because they've had an experience of slowing down such as probably they've never had in their lives before. So I say to them, you've had 18 years experience using these, but there are other ways you can use these. And it takes. But to speak more directly to your question, I think people often come into museums feeling disenfranchised, like they need to have had art history classes, they need specialized vocabulary. And I think if people didn't go in burdened, that they would have a much better experience. But also you need to negotiate art spaces. So nobody would go into a library and pull every book off the shelf. But what do we do in a museum gallery? We feel like we have to look at everything. So one piece of my advice would be is let your eye guide you. Don't feel obliged to look at everything. See what calls to you, because things will call to you, and you will sort of develop your own profile, your own visual profile of what appeals to you and what doesn't, and give yourself time in front of that object. This reminds me also of a conversation I had with Philippe de Montebello once. And we were talking about this issue, and I said, okay, let's say we're not going along with you, Monsieur de Montebello. What should we do when we get to a museum? And he said, it's very simple. He said, you start off in the gift shop. He says, you go and look at the postcards, and you'll see what are the most important objects in the collection. Start there. Okay. Okay.
Could you tell us what you see in the image above you? The cigarette, the lady breathing, the vehicle driving by?
Yeah, thank you. So I talked about in the Marioni painting how these drips are suspended. You can't tell whether they're coming to rest or about to fall. I think that this video is a wonderful dramatization of the question of suspension in two senses. The cigarette ash is suspended from the cigarette filter, but it's also about narrative suspense, because we identify with the smoker, and as the flame gets closer and closer to his fingers, I at least ask myself, does he have, as the French say, the sang-froid, the nerve to keep holding the cigarette? And in fact, the artist told me that he'd burned his fingers. And in the same way, the woman next to him had a stiff neck for days. So I think that the video is about suspense and suspension, and I think one of the things that for me is charming about it is if I were to tell you that I'm going to show you a 7-minute video in which nothing happens except a man smokes a cigarette, and you're going to be fascinated by it, you'd look at me and lock me up. But I think it works. I guess the other thing I would say is, if you notice, traffic was going by outside the window, and you can see just very briefly these flashes of reflection. So it's, again, that mix of speed and slowness. Are we done? Okay, thank you so much for coming.